Hey, I'm Bob Cargill, and I'm here with a special guest. This is William Schniedewind. He's professor of biblical studies and Near Eastern languages and cultures at UCLA, and the newly appointed director of the Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA. Bill, thank you for joining us. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here. It's great to be here.
Today we want to talk about a new book that Bill wrote. This is called Who Really Wrote the Bible? And it's a story of
The Scribes.
The biblical scribes, yeah. So I guess that's the obvious answer. Scribes wrote the Bible.
Right.
But tell us, who are these scribes? So I guess the obvious answer is who wrote the Bible? Scribes did. But who are these guys? Who are the scribes?
Yeah, so I was really interested in this problem of who wrote the Bible from the perspective of exploring what was it like to be an ancient scribe, how one became a scribe, how one learned to read and write in ancient Israel. And when I was working on this problem, I realized that, scribes learned through apprenticeship. I mean, you learned as an apprentice, and for this reason, actually, scribe wasn't a title. Like, it's not like a modern author. It's not.
Right.
It's not a synonym for a modern author. Scribe is actually a skill in a profession.
Right.
So, for example, you might be a government bureaucrat and a scribe. You might be a priest and a scribe. You might be a prophet and a scribe. You might be a merchant and a scribe. So scribe is a profession, and the way you learn to read and write was in your profession, you were apprenticeship. It was apprenticeship.
So you learned by watching someone else, learning from someone else.
And learning in small groups, right? In some ways, it's like a doctoral program where you have a master, a professor, and then you have like a small group of students, right? And in this process, you create a certain kind of relationship. When learning is done in an apprenticeship. It's funny that the professor who teaches a student is a Dr. Father or Dr. Mutter, right? The German word. Right. I mean, it's a familial term, right? And it's because the students are kind of like your children.
Right.
And actually, those familiar terms are actually used in the Bible to describe these communities because apprenticeship learning creates communities of people, what anthropologists would call communities of practice. So scribes in ancient Israel were part of different kinds of communities. And my book is sort of then laid out in the different types of communities that learned to read and write and then wrote parts of the Bible. And so there are Jerusalem priests, there are peripheral priests. Those are two different communities of practice. There are, military scribes. There are government bureaucrats.
Right.
Yeah. There are prophets are a type of scribe. There, and you actually see the communal aspects of it, like in the stories of Elijah and Elisha.
Sure.
So for Elijah calls Elisha his son.
Right.
But they're not related.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
And when Elisha ascends to heaven, what does Elisha say? My father, my father. Right. It's not his father.
No. That's right.
But
he takes up the mantle.
And then Elisha has his own sons, quote unquote. Right. And there's one really great passage in 2 Kings 9 where the text says that Elijah took one of the sons of the prophets, and he told this guy to go and anoint Jehu as king of Israel. And then the text says the Na'ar, that is the apprentice of the prophet, went and anointed him. So in this, you see both the apprenticeship as a concept, but you also see the familial, group, the sons of the prophet. What are the sons of the prophet? They are a group of an apprentice that's created by apprenticeship. And I actually think prophet then, the sons of the prophet are where the concept of prophetic scribes come from in ancient Israel.
So these aren't his actual children, or these aren't the descendants. These are the people that he's training up, and you think they're actually the scribes, the people who are writing for the prophet.
Exactly. And one of the great examples of this also is like with the prophet Isaiah, right? In chapter 8 of Isaiah, Isaiah tells it's in Hebrew, it says his limudim, which we could translate as his students or his children. He tells his limudim, right, his students, or disciples to collect his oracles.
Right.
And then in the next, a couple verses later, it says he calls these people his children.
Right.
He calls the students his children. And then actually, I think that works out physically in the inscriptional record.
No way, really? How so?
A few years ago, they found a seal impression that is widely ascribed to being belonging to Isaiah the prophet.
Right, I remember this.
Yeah. Well, the really interesting thing is that in that collection of seal impressions, there was another seal impression. And the seal impression reads, Iddo Yahu, the son of Isaiah.
Oh, you don't think that's actually the physical son?
Well, we don't know for sure. It could be, but it could just be an apprentice, because we know that apprenticeship is the way. And the other thing that's really interesting is, think about the name. You remember the name Iddo?
Yeah.
I mean, the root in Hebrew means to witness. Right. And there's actually an Aramaic inscription that talks about the Idadin or Adadin, that is the witnesses, and the Hayin, the seers. And there are other biblical prophets like Iddo and Iddo Yahu that are mentioned who are called seers or prophets in the Bible. So not only does the root of the Hebrew word mean to witness, so it seems like Isaiah's apprentice or son actually has a name that's related to the prophetic profession.
So these are the scribal. These are the scribes of the prophets.
These are the scribes of the prophets, and I think that the original meaning of the word prophet and original role of a prophet had to do with royal advisor, which is what essentially Isaiah is, what Huldah is.
Right.
Nathan.
But he wasn't so much a writer, but he was still giving the advice.
Yeah, I think that later biblical texts redefine the title. Right. And I mean, one of the great examples of this is in the book of Samuel, in 1 Samuel 9:9, it says, formerly in Israel, we used to call the Navi a seer. That is, the prophet was called a seer. But now we call what we used to call a seer, we call a prophet. But what is this text telling you? It's telling you that ancient Israel had this category, we call them seers, and now we're going to take a new word, which is the word prophet, and we're going to reassign that word. And one of the great illustrations of this is in the book of Jeremiah. In the book of Jeremiah, there are two texts. There's a short text of Jeremiah that we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also from the Septuagint. And there's the long Masoretic text, which is the traditional text of the Bible. And in the short version, it doesn't call him Jeremiah the prophet. He's just Jeremiah the priest. And in the long version, in the Masoretic version, 28 times they add the title Hanavi, or the prophet, to Jeremiah. So it changes him. And when is this happening? This is probably happening in the Persian period, in the post-exilic period. And the Jewish scribes in the Persian period are taking this title, prophet, and they're applying it to lots of people. They're applying it to Moses. They're going to apply it to Aaron. They're going to apply it to Miriam. And they're just taking a title that was probably narrowly used in the Iron Age, in the earlier periods, and then applying it very broadly. Eventually, David's going to be a prophet, and lots of people are going to eventually become called prophets.
But it's funny that you mentioned that they applied it to Moses as someone who was the lawgiver, essentially responsible for the Torah, right? Is responsible for this set of laws that would become this book. Is that one of the reasons why you think that there weren't just prophetic scribes, but there were also other kinds of scribes? Moses was also a priest, was he not?
I mean, Moses was a Levite. And if you think, one of the things I do in this book is do the history of scribes and scribal communities. And a major point is that when we get to the Persian period, post-exilic period, there aren't very many Hebrew scribes. All the infrastructure for writing Hebrew has essentially disappeared outside the temple. And so scribes in the Persian period are essentially the people who are related to the Jerusalem temple. And they had their own thoughts, about like what was a legitimate scribe. So like, why would they relabel Jeremiah, who was a priest, as a prophet? Well, I mean, what's the problem of Jeremiah? He's not a priest in Jerusalem. He's a priest from Anathoth. But you can't say, well, he's not Jeremiah. He's already this major figure, so what do? They relabel him as a prophet, and now he's no longer, now we know him as a priest. They were successful, right?
Right.
We think of him no longer as a priest, even though that's what he was. He was a priest from Anathoth.
Right. But is that because they were exiled? That was part of that priestly line that was pushed out, and they didn't want to acknowledge that, so they made him into a prophet?
Yeah, Jeremiah was part of that peripheral priests.
Right.
And the peripheral priests weren't part of the Jerusalem priests. The Jerusalem priests wanted to keep, the purity of the Jerusalem priestly line.
Right.
And so people who didn't fit in, like Jeremiah, or even Moses. I mean, Moses is an important figure, but he's not a Aaronite priest.
Correct.
He's a Levite.
Right.
Or, there are other figures too, like Samuel. He's appointed in the temple, right? He's apprenticed to a priest.
With Eli there.
Right. But he's an Ephraimite.
Right.
He's not a priest.
Right.
So what do? I mean, in 1 Samuel 9:9, one of the things they do is they give him the label, Samuel's a prophet. And that's the way we think of Jeremiah. So, or Samuel. So they're successful in relabeling Samuel as a prophet. But one of the things we're missing in this sort of history of the prophetic scribal community is that in the early period, the prophetic scribal community was related to administration and in an official capacity, as opposed to this idea of the prophet whom God calls from the birth, like Jeremiah, right? So there's this evolution of scribal communities and sometimes titles. Like, so in the very latest time, when we get to the end of the Second Temple period, scribe actually does become a profession.
Right.
But then we've moved into a different thing where the temple has professionals who are copying and creating books, and that's all they do.
But they're no longer composing new text, right? These guys are copying.
Yeah, they're no longer
official
composing.
Text.
Right. And what is a scribe right now? A scribe isn't an author.
Right.
It's essentially a professional who's working in the late Second Temple period. Because if you think about what happens in the late Second Temple period, is that synagogues become very common.
Right. Wait. This is a new piece of research, right? Because 30, 40 years ago, synagogues were only in the in AD and in CE, right? 2nd century CE. But the latest research is showing that synagogues are appearing 1st and 2nd century BC. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was a student 40 years ago.
Right.
21 years old, go to Israel. And I took this seminar with Leve, who wrote the book on the synagogue. And I remember vividly in that seminar him telling us, there are no synagogues in the Second Temple period. Synagogues are a 3rd, 4th century CE phenomenon. Right. Fast forward 40 years, and now we've excavated, like 20 synagogues that date to the Second Temple period.
Right.
And there's 2 synagogues. They excavated 2 synagogues from the 1st century CE, BC, CE from one Magdala.
Right.
One Jewish village has 2 synagogues, right? So now we're every year. I was just at a meeting and I just heard a paper on yet another Jewish synagogue from maybe the 2nd century BC. So every year that goes by, it's another Jewish synagogue. So now we can just sort of project. We know from what's coming on that there are hundreds of Jewish synagogues, and we also know from things like the Theodotian inscription where it talks about what you do in the synagogue. You read Torah and other texts. We also know texts like Josephus where he talks about synagogues and scrolls in synagogues, or in the New Testament in Luke 4, Jesus gets up in a synagogue and he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, right?
Yeah.
So where did they get that scroll of Isaiah?
They had to,
they had to get it from Jerusalem.
Right.
Unless they rejected Jerusalem, the Essenes probably wouldn't have gotten.
Right. The Essenes probably got it from somewhere else or made their own.
Right.
Right.
But in Jerusalem, they're probably professional scribes who are copying the Torah.
Right.
Books like Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Isaiah are the most common scrolls that we have. So those are probably the scrolls that were most common in synagogues.
Right.
And they're copying. So you have professionals. So scribe in this time period, in the late Second Temple period, does become a profession. Whereas I would argue that in ancient Israel, scribe is just a skill of a different profession
that someone else possesses.
Yeah. Well, like in the book of Ezra, it says Ezra is a priest and a scribe.
Right.
Like his job is to be a priest.
To be a priest, but he also knows how to write.
He knows how to write, and so he has this title of being a scribe, but that's not his profession.
Right.
But when you get to the Second Temple period, to the time of first century BC or first century CE, the time of the rabbis or Jesus, there were actual scribes who that's their job.
That were just to make copies of this. People from synagogues all over throughout Israel probably came in and paid for these copies of these, and that allowed them to be paid as scribes. It created an industry.
Right, they created an industry, and we know from some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have what we call deluxe scrolls or presentation scrolls, and these are the kind of scrolls where you have these very wide margins, they're lined, the letters are written in very ornate script. It probably takes a scribe like many months to produce one of these very carefully produced scrolls, and also it would cost an enormous amount of time. It might cost $25,000 or $50,000 to produce a scroll. So, I mean, a poor synagogue at a place like Nazareth or Capernaum, or probably couldn't afford an entire Bible, but so they could afford to get a copy of Deuteronomy and Psalms and Isaiah, but they can't have So if you want to go and read Job, for example, you probably have to go to Jerusalem, or you maybe go to a major city like Caesarea or Tiberias, where they might have a larger collection of scrolls.
That's an interesting point. Those are not only the Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Psalms. These are not only the most frequently found ones at Qumran, they're the most frequently quoted ones in the New Testament. These are the most frequently quoted books, probably because those are the ones that they had the most access to.
Exactly. It makes perfect sense. Right. Now we know why it's the most quoted book in the New Testament is because if you went to a synagogue on Shabbat and you had a synagogue reading, you probably heard Isaiah or you heard Psalms or you heard Deuteronomy. And so that's why those are the quotes.
Those are what you know best.
Those are the things you know, right? You're not going to quote Job because you don't know Job.
Right, yeah. Well,
it's
hard enough anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey everyone, Jordan here. I've got some exciting news. We're happy to announce that our first online course is now available, The Cities of the Bible with Dr. Robert Cargill. In this new class, Dr. Cargill will provide you with a tour of several key cities that made the greatest impact on the composition of the Bible. Across a series of 8 talks, you'll learn about cities like Babylon, Qumran, Rome, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and more. Along the way, Dr. Cargill will examine the intersection of archaeological sites, artifacts, and ancient texts, explaining how archaeology not only illuminates the Bible, but actually contributed to the very production of the Bible itself. This course is available to everyone through our Patreon shop, and you can find the link down in the description. But now, let's get back to the podcast.
So, for viewers watching, that you've talked a lot about Jeremiah. There's also, he had a scribe, an amanuensis, so somebody, Baruch. What would be his role in relation to Jeremiah?
I mean, I would say that Baruch is essentially Jeremiah's apprentice. Right? Yeah. I mean, that's what he is. He's not an amanuensis. He's
his son.
Apprentice. Yeah, he's apprentice to Jeremiah, and
that's an interesting theory because I had always learned that Jeremiah was speaking and Baruch was the one that was writing down. But if Jeremiah is the actual scribe, then he's just learning beneath him, and then Baruch's going to go on and have the letter of Baruch, right? Or one of these more apocryphal texts. So let's get back to the question: Who wrote the Bible? Who really wrote it?
Scribal communities, and that's the other thing that my book is going to say or make the case as, what's the problem that is generated by is the fact that the Bible doesn't have authors. Like if you get the book of Genesis, like where's the author? Right. It's not like
Moses, right? Moses have
right, but those answers are in the reception of the Bible.
Correct.
They're not in the composition of the Bible. So you look like in Greek literature, like Herodotus, is the author, of his histories, or Thucydides, or Aristophanes, and Greek literature has authors. And so when Jewish literature in the Persian Hellenistic period begins to encounter Greek literature,
you get authors all of a sudden.
Yeah, well, then the question is, well, the Greeks have, Herodotus and Aristophanes and, Aristotle or whatever, like who wrote our Bible?
Right.
But the problem is when you look in Genesis, it doesn't say, and Exodus doesn't say, and even Deuteronomy doesn't say that Moses is the author. It begins, these are the words which Moses spoke.
Right.
It's not like, Moses wrote this.
Right.
And, you do have a couple places where authors kind of emerge in the Bible, but it's the exception to the rule.
Right.
So there's passages in Ezra where Ezra's voice comes forward, or Nehemiah's voice.
Right. But these are later texts. These are much later texts.
Yeah, but I mean, so I'm not saying that you can't have authors, but in general,
the
Bible is a book without authors. And it's not just the Bible. I mean, if you look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead, right? Or even like Gilgamesh isn't, or if we're looking at other kinds of literature from the Near East, generally speaking, you don't have the concept of authorship. And I think the reason is because the texts were written and collected and passed on in scribal communities.
Like communities. These are community texts.
These are community texts that are passed on and compiled, and the idea of it was to, you collect it, you collate it, and then you pass it on within the community. You don't, and if you have the book of Isaiah, sometimes in the book, there are a couple places in the book of Isaiah where you see the voice of Isaiah, right? And like, for example, in Isaiah 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, who saw the Lord? I saw the Lord. You see the voice of Isaiah.
Right.
But that's the exception in the book that proves the rule, which is that the book of Isaiah doesn't have an author, right? It begins, the vision of Isaiah, which he saw. It begins as a presentation of Isaiah as a character, not as an author. So that's the problem that sort of generates the book. And then you look at the way scribes learned in apprenticeships and communities, and then you realize these are texts that are produced by different communities as opposed to authors. And it's only in the reception of the Bible that we get this concept or the attempt to give the Bible authors.
So the scribal communities are the ones that wrote these texts or collected these traditions, wrote these texts, and then redacted these texts and passed them down.
Right.
And by the time you get into the late Second Temple period, now they're handed off. These compositions that were composed, let's say, are now handed down to a professional class of scribes whose job it is now to copy these texts
and make copies, and
the text is fixed now, right?
And that's the interesting thing now, that once you realize that the Jerusalem temple has to make dozens and dozens of copies of Deuteronomy and Psalms and Isaiah and other texts for all the synagogues, now we have the emergence of we would call the Proto-Masoretic text, or the standardized text. And this pushes back the theories about the later development of the Proto-Masoretic text to like the 3rd, 2nd century, I would say 3rd, 2nd century BC.
That's not the traditional theory.
No, it's not the traditional theory. Usually we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find what scholars would call a pluriform text.
Mhm.
There are lots of different minor variations in the book of Jeremiah or the book of Deuteronomy or the book of whatever, in the Bible. And scholars are always emphasizing the pluriformity of the Bible in the Second Temple period.
Multiple different traditions. Why does Qumran have multiple different traditions? And you're arguing for a more singular tradition at an earlier date. How do you explain that?
Because at Qumran, right, you have an Essene community, an Essene library, and the Essenes rejected Jerusalem. Because they rejected Jerusalem, if the Essenes need a copy of Deuteronomy, they're not calling the temple in
the wicked
Jerusalem
priest,
and the wicked priest to get them a copy of. They have their own decentralized system of copying scrolls.
Right.
But decentralizing the system of copying the scrolls means you can't standardize it. What do you need to standardize a text? You need it to be in a central place.
Right.
So if all the scrolls were copied in Jerusalem and you need to, make multiple copies of the book of Isaiah or the book of Genesis, you're not going to have an eclectic text. You're going to be taking this text and you're going to be copying it over and over again.
Right.
Standardizing the text, what we would call the Proto-Masoretic text. But if I'm a community like the Essenes and I reject Jerusalem and we want a copy, then we've got an eclectic text. We have a decentralized system. We can't standardize it because we're doing the
coming
copying
from somewhere else.
Yeah, in all kinds of different places.
Right.
And that's what happens in the Dead Sea Scrolls library, and that's why you have a pluriform tradition represented there, because you have a community that rejects Jerusalem as the central authority for the text.
So you get all these different scripts, you get all these different hands coming in, and different letters,
minor differences, and we know that there's a Proto-Masoretic tradition already from some of the scrolls at Qumran, and actually we see it. Recently they excavated a scroll at the synagogue in En-Gedi, and there's a lot of debate. It was a scroll of the book of Leviticus, and it was heavily burnt, but using some imaging technology, they were able to digitally unroll the scroll.
They can like a CAT scan through it.
And it's letter for letter the Masoretic text. It's exactly the same.
Yeah.
And it's because En-Gedi reflects, this tradition of synagogues that probably went to Jerusalem to get their standardized text. And it also explains something, because after the destruction of the Second Temple, by the Romans, Judaism dispersed, right? Yeah. They no longer had a central place to standardize the text of the Bible. So this also, the rise of the synagogue in the Second Temple period also explains how you can get a standardized text. Because if we put the rise of the Masoretic text after the destruction of the temple, then you create the problem of not having a central place in order to standardize the text. But if the text was largely standardized before the destruction of the temple, then by the Jerusalem temple, then you're essentially the Proto-Masoretic text in the synagogue, later synagogue, is a legacy of that tradition.
Right. And if you've already got the synagogues popping up in the 2nd century, and the standardized text is there, and they're sending it out to these synagogues, when the temple is destroyed, you've already got a propagation of that standardized text throughout all the synagogues, official text throughout all the synagogues, and that standardized text can continue. That tradition can continue even without the temple.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So scribal communities composed and then later carried out this biblical text, this official Masoretic text. Synagogues are earlier than we thought. The Masoretic text is earlier than we thought. And that's how we got the Bible that we have today.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Bill, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The book is Who Really Wrote the Bible? Go out and buy it today. Bill, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.